My name is Mike Savage from London School of Economics. Very pleased to be presiding on this session, which in many ways follows one of the key themes of this conference, which is trying to make sense of the current situation, which has come as something of a surprise. I mean, and this particular session is really devoted to papers coming in a special issue of the British Journal of Sociology in November. The origin of the session really come from conversations between myself, Michel Lamont and Nigel Dodd, who's editor of the BJS, in the immediate aftermath of the election of Donald Trump last November, when we were reflecting upon similarities, differences between the Brexit vote in Britain in June last year and the issue of Trump. So questions of populism, the elite being out of touch, the significance of geographical divides, class, racism, all these issues have obviously circulated in both cases. And we wanted the BJS to be in there first with a kind of rapid response to these issues. And so thanks to fantastic authors who managed to produce papers at a very short notice, the issue will appear, we think, on November the 8th, exactly a year after the election of Donald Trump. And we hope it'll be a really important statement about how sociologists should respond to the challenges of our times. Now, I have to say, obviously we have, I think, 9 papers in the special issue. We've only got 4 being presented today, most of whom have an American rather than a British focus. If there is time in the session, I'll make a few reflections about the British case. And if any of you were at the session on class and culture on Saturday, you'll have heard Lisa Mackenzie talking about her ethnography of working class Britain, which will be one of the papers in the special issue. But the papers today predominantly focus upon the American case, with the exception of our first speaker, Patrick Legallows, who is, where he's gone, who will be speaking about general issues of governance in, across Europe and North America. So we'll start with Patrick, wherever he is. Oh, he's there. And then we'll move on to Bo Young, who will be presenting on the paper collaboratively with Michel Lamont. If any of you were at Michelle's presidential lecture last night, you'll have heard her refer to it. So it's the way it fits into Michelle's thinking will be clear. And Michelle was hoping to pop in when it's being presented. Actually, yeah, Bo Young, sorry, we're having to juggle with different PowerPoint technologies. Bo Young will actually be last, sorry. Paul Pearson from Berkeley will be second, and then Michael McCoy from the LSE. We're going to try and keep the presentations concise so that there'll be time for discussion at the end. So without more ado, one thing I should also say is that the session is being filmed by the British Journal of Sociology. It'll appear on the website. When it comes to questions and answers, if you don't want to be on the video, don't ask questions. Patrick.
Hello, thank you, Mike, for setting up this panel, and thanks to Michelle to give us the opportunity to present some work. The paper I'm presenting is a co-authored with Desmond King, who is a political scientist at Nuffield College, Oxford, and works on the American state. It's a joint project of ours. The title is The Three Constituencies of a State, Why the State Has Lost Its Unifying Energy. As you all know, there's quite a sense of alienation and anger towards existing political order, not just in the US with Trump or just in Britain with the Brexit vote, but also in a number of other European countries, including mine, of course, with the Le Pen vote, but also in Sweden or Netherlands or Hungary. And in many ways, Trump is inspiring a new generation of strong men in Europe. So it's quite an issue we have to deal with. Of course, social scientists have come up with a number of important explanations to make sense of this vote, from the impact of a global trade, or the decline of social mobility, the pillaring of immigrants, the urban process and the rise of metropolis, the rise of income inequalities, the feeling of loss, a question of labor market siders. We have a number of interesting work, and we'll listen to that in the forthcoming paper. What we want to emphasize in this paper is that when we interview some of those people, and what we see also in various accounts, is a sense of loss, which is maybe not a loss of identity as such, but something to do with the state. We hear in the UK campaign a lot of things about we want our country back, we are not protected. In France, the Le Pen voters very often talk about, we have been abandoned, let down by the state. And of course, you have heard about the American carnage. And we know how historically the state and the government has been central to advance the society. So we want to make an argument about the state. This paper is derived from some of the work I've done previously on urban middle class in Europe with my colleague Andreotti and Javier Moreno Fuentes, but more importantly, on this book we just published with Desmond King on the transformation of European states. So what we plan to do is to build, to complement the literature on the political sociology of populist and anti-system voters by examining processes of state transformation in the UK, US, and France. Because we know that historically, political and cultural identities are very strongly, of course, related to the state. So if we have, as we argue, important processes of restructuring of the state, that is going to lead to trouble for a number of citizens. So the argument is that what we see is something like a structural transformation of the state. And those transformations, in part, explain this sense of abandonment that some social groups are feeling. In other words, classically, one element of the state is to protect population. And what we know is that a number of these social groups voting for those populist leaders feel abandoned and they don't feel protected anymore. So we want to explain what is happening in these internal changes to the state's organization and engagement with societies through all sorts of things from displacement, reduced public services, and why do those citizens feeling abandoned by the state? And can I emphasize that it's also something that came out strongly in some of the research we have been doing with state elite and in public policy research. When I was doing research for the northeast of England some years ago, I interviewed a top civil servant of a treasury in London. And we're telling him, what are you doing to do? We have a sort of decline, long-term, strong decline of the northeast of England. So what impact in policy terms? And he answered very coolly, well, as long as it's a gentle decline, why should we bother? So I think this is really the heart of what we want to argue in this paper. Our starting point is to come back on Gianfranco Poggi, a great Italian sociologist of the state, the Weberian sense. And he made a very nice point on the making of a nation state, emphasizing not just the classical elements of the state, but also what he called the unifying energy of the state. To some extent, the modernization of the state in the 20th century, particularly in Europe, but also in the US in different ways, there was this element of developing institutions in order to limit inequalities and to try to, of course, create categories, maps, metrics, and other parameters, to organize, measure, govern, to protect populations. It was mentioned yesterday. Remember those days when governments thought that they would eradicate poverty for good and to reduce inequality. This unifying energy, of course, had different origins, including nationalist movements, combating external influences, preparing citizens for industrialization. But more or less, in different countries, there was this idea that you needed to limit some inequalities, both territorial, at some point ethnic, racial, income inequalities, and it was more or less successful. There was, of course, very strong inequality, but you also tried to bring a sense of unity and to create your political community in terms of identity and culture. What we want to argue is the current phase of state reconfiguration, which is quite strong, we agree. There is something going on in terms of disconnection between state and state elite and the political community, between the nation and the state. And some groups are feeling let down by the state. What we observe in Europe is that some social groups have developed enough resources to be able not to exit from the national community, but to partially exit, to be able to move away, to maximize their interests and their resources, and then to come back in their national society and to improve their situation. But what we also know is this mobility and those impact of globalization means that some groups are less able to exert some voice and less able to be mobile or to take advantage of those changes. So the only chance they have is to exert voice. When you look at data on mobility, there are a number of social groups in Europe, and France is a good example of that, I think the UK as well. The rate of both mobility within the national space and transnational mobility is going down. So some groups are more and more fixed on their territory and cannot move. So the only way they have is voice, more vigorously than they have done before. Our argument about the structural change of the state is the following. Classically, we have been thinking about the state in relation to the political community, the voters, the nation, and this classic thinking sometimes in terms of voters. We argue that, and that was a link of this unifying energy of the state, we argue that nowadays state elite respond to three different constituencies. One, of course, is this classic nation and political community. Second, and the point has been made vigorously by Wolfgang Streeck and Colin Crouch for Europe, it's the idea that more and more of the activities of a state are explained by this interaction, responsiveness, sometimes dependence upon large firms and financial organizations. And there's Streeck, as I'll come back to that in a minute. And the third constituency is that a lot of state actions is explained by this interdependence with other state or transnational organization or international regulating agencies. So the idea is that if you want to understand state public policy these days, you have to understand these complete struggles between those three constituencies. And within the game between the three constituencies, the voice of those disadvantaged social groups or territory is becoming more and more marginalized. And the more they may voice more vigorously what they want to express, but they are becoming more and more peripheral in the political process of decision making. First point, I will not emphasize too much. Classically, this idea of national political community, although a lot of political science work from Paul and Jacob work, looking at politics as a semi-autonomous domain, or Larry Battle's severe criticism of the importance of voting, just emphasize that this is a complicated matter. This idea of disconnection is very strong when you look at markets, large firms, and finance. Colin Crouch, in our book, has done a lovely paper on the limitations of the limited states. And although it's a debated issue, there are quite a number of research showing the extent to which a number of what states are doing is explained by their dependence upon, for instance, financial markets. Less in the US probably, but especially European states becoming more and more in debt, and debt has been increased dramatically. Streeck has made a powerful argument about the rise of the austerity state, where a lot of public policy depend upon how these the financial markets and large firms will behave and will accept to invest or not invest in those elements. In many ways, you could argue that states' activities are very much about making markets. That's John Lady's argument. A lot of political activities is about the making market states, but also in some ways, you could try to find ways in which the markets organizations themselves are part of redefining the limits of a state, like do you take public pensions as part of a public debt or not? So there's a number of decisions on what are the limits of a state that de facto are done by some rating agencies or large organizations, especially private organizations. So, of course, we are not arguing that the states are losing their capacity or not doing anything. The more complex international markets become, the more sophisticated the regulation needed. And is in practice, state activities are very much involved in a whole new range of activities around regulation. But in those new domain of state activities that are expanding very strongly, they are less and less socially targeted. And the voice of those social groups and disadvantaged territory is becoming marginalized. The third constituency of the state, we would argue, is this mix of other state, transnational organization, and transnational regulation agency. In many ways, most states nowadays, that's true for US or for Europe, are branch of transnational regulators to some extent. That gives them opportunity to develop new activities, but on the other end, what they can achieve and who benefits are not the same thing that what they used to do before. So there are different ways to make this argument very clear. One of the nice one is to think about the denationalization of political authority that has been argued by my colleague Genschel and Zengel, but I quite like the work of Chris Bickerton in the UK, who made a point, a European point, on European states becoming member states, by which it means that, in many ways, state elite in Europe are on purpose accepted to devote a number of competence and power at the EU level in order to bound themselves and to isolate themselves from the national community. So when you cannot achieve some reforms, you create external constraints in order to be less dependent upon your national community. It's quite a powerful argument. And when you look at a number of public policy, you see this disconnection between what is expressed as the interest of some groups and voters in regions and for disadvantaged groups, and the priorities set up by transnational organizations or the EU in this case. So the idea that you have more and more supranational norms and standards and interdependence between state elite that creates a very strong pressure on what states are doing at the expense of those social groups who are not part of this game. You could see that with like UK, what the New Labour and Conservative governments have been doing. They were very activist states in many ways, but not activist in the same old way of unifying energy, but activist in market-making states and emphasizing competition. So again, we're not arguing that states are declining. In many ways, when you look at EU countries, the rate of public spending has not declined. Okay? On average, public spending remains quite stable. Declines in some countries, increase in some other countries. It's a small decline, but not much. The debt has been very much reinforced as well. So it's not a question of or more or less, but we argue that part of the activities of those European states in particular is to increase the debt. Jonah Levy coined the phrase anesthesia state. Just, you spend some money to get people stay quiet, but not actively investing in the future of those groups, of those territories. So we argue that those powerful factors and the game between those three constituencies has weakened the capacity for states to counter enduring inequalities and some of this brutality of globalization process. So we argue that because of these three constituencies, that's a structural change of a state undermining this unifying energy of a state that was a very core element of what states were about. To finish off, in the paper, we take one example. We're trying to develop some work on education and health, but we concentrate on the issue of territorial inequality. It's less an issue in the US case, but historically, in European case, that has been a very important case of trying to bring together those different territories. And as you may know, French elite were obsessed through centralization to get all these things together. So we all know about the impact of globalization and knowledge economy on the development of large metropolis. What is striking is the extent to which this has not led to policy at all to try to mitigate the effect. By contrast, what we see in a number of those countries, including mine, was a weakening or abandonment of industrial strategy, the marginalization of what used to be regional policy. The idea of trying to reduce inequality between territories has been completely marginalized in many ways. And the economic policy preference for austerity in a number of countries has gone this way. I don't want to emphasize too much, but just to give you one example, if you look at the change in terms of productivity, the red dot are the capital city in EU country. Basically, over the last 10 years, half of the rise of productivity in EU countries has been concentrated in capital city and high income city. So it's a very strong metropolitization process going on in most European countries. And if you look at inequality between regions, and I'm afraid, I saw that this morning, this is not going very well, the blue line is just emphasizing inequality between regions in the UK, which is growing dramatically and has been increasing over time. This map shows, this is the rise of jobs over the last 1993-2010. So job creation in France has been the West, the South, and Paris. And of course, job declining has been precisely in the northeast of France, deindustrialized. Familiar story is in the UK or in the US, which is, of course, where part of a National Front vote is very strong in the French case. So I think you can really make this idea that, for a French point of view, if I can take my French hat for a second, this is very much counterfactual from what we have seen for a long term. The French obsession for like 7 centuries to try to bring in all these stories together and limit inequalities is now marginalized, and there is no policy to deal with that in any effective way. Even willing to do that, it's not part, and I think we explained that by this change. So conclusion, we argue there's a structural change going on with the states, and these three constituencies think explain what's going on. And that may explain some of this left behind and surging, not just income inequality, but also territorial inequality. And we know, and we've seen some other sessions, how much this territorial dimension is strong. We're not saying it's the only case, but we think that this structural explanation in some countries has to be combined with, of course, the other explanation on more on the behavior of individuals. And this reconfiguration of states seems to us quite a long-term process, which political effect have to be examined very, very carefully. In other words, good luck, President Macron. You have a lot of job to do, and it's not a good start. Thank you.
It's actually my first ASA, so I'm happy to be here saying something about what sociologists can say about Trump and Brexit, even though I'm not a sociologist, but thanks for including me. And I also wanted to say at the start that it's always a caveat I give in these talks is that Jacob Hacker and I have sort of some kind of Vulcan mind meld going on, and we've spoken a lot about these issues, and so there's a lot of his thinking to be reflected in what I'm going to say today. He's here, so if he disagrees with something, he'll let us know. So my paper does focus on the U.S. case, and it's unfortunate in a lot of ways that just given where this meeting is being held that there's less on the European experience, than there is on the American experience. But it's clear that right-wing populism is a transnational phenomenon. But what I am going to just focus on the American case, and part of what I want to suggest is that national particularities, particularly when we come to thinking about how right-wing populism fits into a broader polity, matter a lot. And that's especially going to be true when you turn from thinking about sort of the social movement qualities of right-wing populism to thinking about what its effects are. Right, how it reverberates through the broader society and polity, and think about its consequences. So I think of myself as a student of governance. I pay a lot of attention to what governments do because I think that's highly consequential. And I think it's often the case that you can learn a lot about what's producing those effects by starting with what actually gets done and working backwards from that. By their deeds you shall know them. So for the U.S. case and thinking about this political moment, one useful place to start, I think, is with the Republican coalition's most significant domestic policy initiative, healthcare reform. All right. So if you look, I want to spend a few minutes talking about AHCA, the American Health Care Act, which turned into the Acropolis ellipse, right, as it sort of came unraveled. But only after having passed the House, and only they were just narrowly blocked because they have a very, very small majority in the Senate from pushing legislation through the Senate. But this was their most important domestic priority. They invested enormous political resources in it, and I think it's quite revealing. All right, so let me just say a little bit about it. Massive, massive piece of legislation. We're talking about a sixth or a fifth of the American economy that was going to be fundamentally affected, hastily and secretly pulled together. One of the most upwardly redistributive laws in American history. All right. Hard thing to measure, but I think that's a safe assessment. It didn't just roll back Obamacare. It included devastating cuts in Medicaid, which now serves over 60 million Americans. Right? And in many ways, you could say that the repeal or replace of Obamacare was almost like a Trojan horse for introducing massive Medicaid cuts, which Speaker Paul Ryan referred to as something we've dreamed about since we were drinking beer out of kegs. And Trump, of course, during the campaign, and it was one of the prominent reasons why people saw him as being distinctive from Republicans, traditional Republicans, was that he had promised not to touch Medicaid, along with Social Security and Medicare. Yet the bill that was produced in Congress was, at its core, a radical Medicaid retrenchment bill. Now, if you focus on the Obamacare elements, and particularly the subsidies, the major subsidies that are included in that bill to help people who are not being covered by Medicaid afford to buy health insurance, the redesign in the Republican legislation, it was almost as if it was designed to hurt Trump constituencies. Right? I mean, really, if you look at the tables that show who is going to be most negatively affected by the redesigned subsidies, which were highly disadvantaged to older Americans, right? So people between, say, the ages of 40 and 65, not yet eligible for Medicare, and people in rural areas. These are the groups that were going to be most heavily disadvantaged. And when I say heavily disadvantaged, I mean they were mostly, if they were reliant upon subsidies to get health insurance through the exchanges, they were not going to be able to afford health insurance anymore. Right? And these are predominantly Trump voting constituencies. Right? So that's pretty striking. In addition, an important thing to note about the legislation is incredibly unpopular. There is simply no precedent for a rising political coalition's most important policy initiative to poll at somewhere around 20%. 20%, right? Simply astonishing. And helps to explain why the Republican Party, Republicans in Congress, went to remarkable and unprecedented steps to hide what they were doing, right? And to just lie shameless. I mean, you know, there's always a fair amount of dissembling in politics. There's been an increasing amount of it in national politics over time. But the amount of just shameless, bald-faced lying that went on with respect to this legislation and the extent to which it was simply hidden from view as long as possible is completely unprecedented, and it reflects the fact that this is a bill that was going to be devastating to tens of millions of Americans and polled at 20%. Right? So they tried to keep it hidden. So what's the explanation for why they were doing all this? Well, you know, there's complexity, but basically the explanation is that they wanted to generate money that they could use to cut taxes for the richest 1%, maybe 2% of Americans. Right? All of this, the Medicaid cuts, the cuts in subsidies, were designed to generate big fiscal surpluses that could be turned into tax cuts, including repealing the taxes that had been introduced with the Affordable Care Act. I mean, one thing a lot of people don't realize, the Affordable Care Act was the most downwardly redistributive American public policy since at least the 1960s. Right? It was essentially financed by taxes on the top 1%, 2%. Right? So they wanted to reverse that, but also generate these massive Medicaid cuts that would allow for further tax cuts. Right? So, doesn't sound like populism. Right? So I want to just quickly mention, quickly mention 3 dimensions of the modern Republican coalition, and that situate what we call right-wing populism and what we might call something like Trumpism in a slightly different way. The first is Congress. Right? Thinking about Congress and that part of the Republican establishment, if you want to put it that way. Constitution, you know, Article 1 of the Constitution starts with Congress. It doesn't start with the presidency. And it's a lot longer than Article 2. Right? And political scientists, typically, they also start with Congress when they analyze American politics. Congress has a lot of authority. Right? Well, Republicans have been powerful in Congress for a long time. You know, one of the critical features of American political institutions that might make populism operate differently in an American context, right-wing populism, is the fragmentation of political authority and the possibility, which Jacob and I have written about, that you can be in and against government at the same time. You can possess political power and present yourself as the opposition at the same time. Right? There's a deeply rooted institutional Republican power structure that preceded Trump, which pursued strategies that helped produce Trump, but is not really Trumpist or populist. Now, it's a little hard to characterize exactly what it is, and of course it's a coalition and it's a lot of different things, but you know, the way that Jacob and I have described it is to say that it's increasingly Randian, right? Meaning Ayn Rand. It's increasingly vigorously, passionately libertarian, right? Divides between makers and takers, And actually, when you catch these people in private, people like Paul Ryan, right, they would say that a lot of Trump voters are takers, right? If they're getting Medicaid or they're getting these subsidies, they're takers, right? So there's a lot of opposition within the Republican coalition in Congress to that. Second significant component, plutocrats. Right? Everybody knows it. We don't talk about it as much because Trump takes all the oxygen out of the room, right? Wealthy people, right, along with rich corporations, have greatly expanded their political power, right? Their economic resources and their ability to translate those economic resources into political resources, not just over the last few years, but over the last 4 years. Right? So whether we write a lot about this in American Amnesia, you can read a lot about it in Jane Mayer's book, Dark Money, the work that Theda Skocpol and Alex Hertel-Fernandez have done on the Koch brothers network. We know a lot about this stuff. Right? Now again, these forces pursued strategies that helped produce Trump, but with relatively few exceptions, they are not Trumpian. Right? They're also more Randian. Right? So the health care bill, as well as a lot of what has been going on or is likely to go on with taxes or regulatory policy, environmental issues, owes much more to these forces than to any Trumpist populism. And indeed, he stacked his administration with folks drawn largely from these groupings. Right? If you look at, there are a lot of congressional Republicans who were appointed to the Trump administration, and they were basically from the far right wing, but not especially populist wing, right? Just very, very Randian. Right? Members of Congress moved over to the Trump administration. Trump didn't drain the swamp in these respects, he joined it, or made an alliance with it. Finally, I want to just talk a little bit about a third grouping. There's so much more to say about this than I have time for, which is voters. Right? Maybe 60% of Trump voters are Trump voters. Right before the election, 25% of Republicans said in surveys that they didn't think that Donald Trump was qualified to be president. They voted for him anyway. Right? The striking thing, I think it's completely appropriate that we spend a lot of time talking about the new voters who came into the Republican Party in 2016 and their characteristics. But the striking thing about the 2016 electorate is it looks an awful lot like the 2012 electorate, even though Donald Trump is a really, really different figure. Right? And in fact, the Clinton campaign, rightly or wrongly, one could talk about this. I think the Clinton campaign bet heavily on the idea that by emphasizing how unacceptable Donald Trump was, they could get reluctant Trump voters, right, to vote for her, right, or at least not to vote for him. Right? That effort failed. At the end of the day, they voted for him anyway, even though they thought he wasn't qualified. The differences in the electorates between 2012 and 2016, it's a close election, so it turned out to matter, but they're really pretty marginal, actually. Right? And a lot of this reflects something that political scientists who study voting behavior have been focusing a lot on lately, which is the rise of what they call negative partisanship. Right? So the parties are incredibly polarized, and increasingly, and especially on the Republican side, they hate the other side. Right? So they're voting against Hillary Clinton. Right? They're not voting, a lot of them are not voting for Donald Trump. Right? They see politics in emotional terms, in terms of being members of a team or a tribe, as us versus them. And those voters, at the end of the day, were pulled towards Donald Trump. Right. So populism, I would say, and I don't have time to go into this more, but you get the basic idea. When we think about right-wing populism, we have to think about it as being what I call in the paper an American hybrid, right, in which it's being joined to these already extant, very powerful and quite distinctive forces within American politics, associated with the particular strategy of anti-government governance that Republicans have developed over the past generation and the way they've fed on hatred of government and reinforced a sense of government dysfunction, on the rise of plutocrats and big money in politics and the changes in corporate political behavior that Jacob and I have chronicled. and on the polarization of voters, which allows this kind of division between us versus them, in which people are willing to vote for a candidate who they actually think is contemptible in a lot of ways. All right. So let me just quickly say something about implications, and then I'll stop. And implications of thinking about right-wing populism as connecting to what I'm calling an American hybrid. The first is to make a point, I think, of relevance to the broader task facing this issue that we're producing, which is that when we do think about right-wing populism and we try to think about it comparatively, it is really important to think about how these kinds of social movements, which again I think do have very strong commonalities across countries, and I agree very much with what Patrick was saying, both about the weakening of the state and about the new geographic structures in the economy, which also reinforce this sense of being left behind for large, spatially distinctive groups within these polities. So there are lots of commonalities, but we want to think about what I'm just going to, for the time being, call the opportunity structures for right-wing populism, which are quite different in different national configurations, right? So the particular kind of marriage between Trumpism and the kind of, I'm going to say, the kind of pathological developments that have been taking place within the Republican coalition for a generation, right, really need to be carefully examined. And they're going to be quite different. The opportunity structures are going to be quite different in the United States than they would be in some other country. All right. What are the implications for thinking about the U.S.? All right. There's an optimistic story. There's a pessimistic story. Right? And I'm not going to prognosticate, because no political scientist at this point should be prognosticating. Optimistic take. There's a lot of room for disorder, contention, and eventual collapse within the Republican coalition, right? Given the range of forces at play that I've talked about. And you can see a lot of that already. Right? You can see it. And another element of it connects to what Patrick was saying, and relates very much to the theme that Jacob and I have explored in our work recently, is the Republican Party now, the congressional party, is like the dog that caught the car, right? You know, they've been barking and barking, you know, for years about how horrible government is, right? And how great everything would be if they were just in charge, right? Well, now they've caught the car, right? And the truth is, they don't have a clue about how to govern with the kinds of problems that modern societies face, right? And their solutions are mostly incredibly unpopular, right? And not likely to address the kind of problems that they face. And so just parenthetically, I'll say, you know, Trump is unprecedentedly unpopular for a president at this point in his term, and that's despite the fact that the unemployment rate is, you know, below 4.5%. That's impressive. That's impressive, right? You know, imagine what happens if the unemployment rate starts to go up. So there's a huge governance problem within the modern Republican coalition. So the optimistic story is there's just a lot of reason to think that this guy's going to become more and more unpopular, that congressional Republicans are going to become more and more unpopular. Pessimistic implication. The structure and imperatives of the Republican coalition, combined with the country's unusual political institutions, have allowed Trump to punch above his weight, right? The core right-wing populist coalition for Trumpism is maybe 25% of the country. Right? You could argue, you know, it's not 40. Right? Yeah. It's closer to 25, right? Okay. But given this particular configuration, right, that 25% can carry a lot of weight, right? Because they can win a party's nomination, and once they win a party's nomination, they can bring a lot of the voters who are involved in this negative partisanship home, right? And with the right set of circumstances, crummy candidate on the other side, you know, at this particular time in history, she was a crummy candidate, right? You know, Democrats have been in office for two terms. You've got the FBI. You know, there's a lot of things combine to make this possible. You can go from 25% to controlling the presidency. Right? And then you've got Congress independently, which has lots and lots of reasons to want to get along with the president. Right? And is involved in a Faustian bargain with the president. Now, Jake and I have been thinking recently about this old Sidney Poitier, Tony Curtis film, The Defiant Ones, from the late 1950s, where these two guys, they're chained together, two escaped prisoners, they're chained together, right? They may come to not like each other. They start not liking each other, right? But they're still chained together, right? So they have a lot of reason to figure out how to cooperate, whether they like being in that situation or not. Some ways it's not a perfect analogy for what's going on, but I think increasingly it is. And one needs to really recognize the extent to which these forces are chained together and the implications of that. So the pessimistic story would say that even with the increasing tensions within this coalition, when push comes to shove, they're going to have strong incentives to try to hold together, and indeed to take steps, right, that will actually encourage people on their sides hatred of the opposition, right, the things that join them together rather than divide them. Right? And one can think about what some of those things might be. Right? But again, the bottom line that I want to emphasize is there are a lot of other things going on in conservative politics in the United States besides Trumpism, and we really have to think about how it connects up to these other elements of the polity to make sense of what's happening.
Hi, I'm Michael McQuarrie. I'm an associate professor of sociology at the London School of Economics. This paper, like Patrick's, is concerned with issues of inclusion and belonging, as well as institutional transformations that help explain why we're seeing relatively unusual political behavior in a lot of countries. But my focus is more on the role of the civil sphere and the public sphere in explaining these unusual outcomes. I'm also not going to be doing a national story like Paul was. I'm interested in the Rust Belt itself, partially because I spent a lot of time there working. I also have done a lot of research on the Rust Belt in other areas. And these were decisive in the election. They were states that Democrats expected to win. They were states that Democrats needed to win. And they were states that the Democrats lost. But I also want to shift the thinking a little bit from Trump and why people support Trump to why they don't like Democrats that they used to like. So I'm going to start with a core thesis, and that's a very simple one. Trump's election is the product of a regional revolt centered on the Rust Belt. But in emphasizing the Rust Belt, I want to break the usually automatic link to the role of economic anxiety, and instead look at the role of cultural and political marginalization in producing the Trump vote. More precisely, the Fordist economy was in a state of collapse some time ago, but the civic culture and public sphere it sustained, and which facilitated the inclusion and citizenship of industrial workers in their communities, has taken much longer to collapse. Indeed, the half-life of deindustrialization, or the slow dismantling of an entire social order, is far more important for understanding the Rust Belt revolt of 2016 than structural unemployment itself. So the ultimate driver of this revolt is the collapse of the institutional lash-up, which facilitated inclusion and citizenship, and that was organized around a Fordist regime of accumulation. In socioeconomic terms, this institutional collapse is the product of an economic transition from Fordist production centered on industrial manufacturing to a knowledge, services, and financialized political economy. In geographic terms, this is manifested in capital flight from the former center of Fordist production in the upper Midwest and to the coast and to a lesser extent, the South. In institutional terms, it is the manifestation of the collapse of a civic culture and a public sphere that was rife with divisions of race and class, but that nonetheless sustained an anti-corporate and redistributional liberalism. In cultural terms, there are two shifts going on. One is the privileging of merit over seniority and institutional loyalty, the credentialed over the uncredentialed, interpersonal performance over physical productivity, and ultimately the replacement of the industrial worker as the universal class associated most strongly with being American by professionals. The election continued the sorting of the electorate by race and cultural capital and even accelerated it. But, as Paul was pointing out, with 92% of the electorate voting for the same party they usually vote for, the national shifts were actually pretty minor. But this characterization of consequential voting is nonetheless misleading. It attributes the outcome to the way voting motivations intersect with individual attributes to produce predictable voting behavior. We can think of this as a linear or an actuarial way of characterizing voting behavior, and it is typical of a moment when our knowledge of the public primarily comes through polling representative samples of voters that are abstracted from their communities and the public sphere, making the role of place, region, in the election's outcome obscure. And this is unusual because lots of American politics historically has been defined by conflicts between regional political economies and cultures. It's only more or less since the 1960s and 1970s that we started thinking of it primarily through, as bunches of individuals that share or differ on certain attributional categories. So here we have a case where large swings in a few counties tip states that Obama won handily into the Republican column. Macomb County is a county that's been focused on a lot. It's a working class community on the outskirts of Detroit. But a county that I'm much more familiar with is Mahoning. I used to do a lot of work in Youngstown as a labor organizer. Youngstown is essential for delivering Ohio to Democrats. It almost always votes overwhelmingly Democratic. And in this last election, Clinton managed to beat Trump by 3% in Mahoning County. Mahoning County was the center of American steel production, and at the time, worldwide steel production. It was overwhelmingly working class, unionized, and so on. But this is not exclusively a revolt of white workers, as it's often characterized. There are black people in Mahoning County too. But of course, black people don't usually vote for Trump. They certainly didn't vote for Trump in this election, or wouldn't vote for somebody like Trump. But what we do see in Rust Belt territories in black communities is declining turnout. So black turnout plummeted in Milwaukee, West Philadelphia, Detroit, Mahoning, Cuyahoga, at far higher rates than they did nationally. In all of these places, turnout declined by 10, and in some cases over 20%. This despite the fact that the election was billed as a referendum on white supremacy. Black voters in Rust Belt counties, as well as white ones, rejected Clinton, even if, unlike white voters, they didn't vote for Trump. So taking those two together, it is clear that the 2016 election result, at least as far as Rust Belt voters were concerned, was the outcome of a regional working class revolt against the Democratic Party. The party that once represented the working class and its values has come to represent quite the opposite. It is a party of the coasts, professionals, cultural producers, and I dare say in this forum, academics. The key question is why this is manifested with such geographic concentration, and why now? It makes little sense to interpret the Rust Belt revolt against the Democratic Party as simply the effect of deindustrialization or economic anxiety, when deindustrialization was more proximate to the experience of more workers who were better organized and more mobilized in 1996 than they were in 2016. But such factors aren't irrelevant either. Institutions, markets, and communities all intersect in geography to produce places. When the upper Midwest was the global metropole of Fordistic production, it was transformed through massive amounts of capital investment provided by private markets in the state. The upper Midwest was the epicenter of a vortex that sucked in capital and people from across the globe, and in the process, transformed the space and institutions of the region as a whole. In describing Fordism, as Gramsci did, in describing Fordism, Gramsci did not merely set out to describe the economic arrangements of production that enabled, or the arrangements that enabled stable and reproducible reproduction and accumulation. He set out to describe the social, cultural, and political arrangements that secured consent to class domination. If we abandon Gramsci's Marxian framework for a more homegrown one, we might say that a paycheck is insufficient grounds by itself to secure social and cultural inclusion, recognition, and integration. Fordism facilitated a whole set of spatial and institutional arrangements that operated from the neighborhood to the nation, that integrated the main constituents of industrial capitalism into national life. The main mechanisms of this were spatial Keynesianism, which entailed an urban and regional development policy paradigm that enrolled numerous constituencies in a broad liberal project sustained by the Democratic Party in particular, but which notably treated black communities as sinks for containing the tensions and contradictions of this project. Local governments that actively involve people in relevant stakes of political engagement, primarily as a function of the fact that federal transfers were delivered to municipal governments where they could be distributed through a political process. Local businesses that actively spent through community foundations on issues that were inadequately addressed by government policy. Civic associations that became avenues for engagement in the public sphere across lines of difference. And lastly, unions, which have decisively anchored workers in the Democratic Party, even as the party itself has abandoned them. So, if practical citizenship depends upon a sense of belonging, institutional recognition, and social solidarity, the Midwest in the post-war era was a central geography for sustaining it. The social and political integration of the region, despite being a multiracial, multi-ethnic, and ecumenical society that was riven with class and race divisions, was one of the key social achievements of the post-war era. And understanding the ways the civic culture and the public sphere of the region worked is at least as important for understanding the Rust Belt revolt as deindustrialization is. So deindustrialization created a crisis starting in the 1970s, but the civic culture and institutions of citizenship and social solidarity that were incubated in and in many ways privileged the region have taken much longer to dismantle. Much of this is the result of intentional dismantling, such as the sustained attacks on labor unions, not just by companies that don't want to sign contracts, but by politicians, civil servants, and as recent election campaigns at Volkswagen and Nissan plants in the South make clear, well-funded civil society efforts. But much of it is also a result of the fact that the conditions that enabled the civic culture to reproduce itself have disappeared. Community foundations can no longer depend upon the growth and reproduction of a local capitalist class. Those people aren't there anymore. To the extent they are, they don't invest in their communities. The community power that unions are able to mobilize is undermined by capital mobility and a policy paradigm that encourages shifting investment to other territories and sectors. Local public spheres are undermined by the fact that municipalities in the region have fewer resources and benefit from fewer federal transfers, which means there's less and less to actually discuss in local politics. Local media has refeudalized around discrete interests and communities, while bridge-building media like local newspapers have disappeared. The collapse of institutions and organizations that sustain the possibility of civic belonging and the negotiation of social solidarity across lines of difference leaves the field open to ideological appeals, which are premised on polarization for the purposes of mobilization, rather than developing solutions in the kind of citizenship that results from active engagement and governance. So while others have described elements of this, I do want to single out Josh Pasevich's work in particular on the transformation of local governance and partisanship in particular. I want to focus here myself on unions for a minute. Since Lyndon Johnson's landslide victory in 1964, which heralded the possibility of a dominant Democratic Party coalition that unified the black and white working and middle class, Republicans have exploited racial prejudice to peel off whites without having to concede redistribution as social policies. Democrats have often responded with similar racial dog whistling or even the active promotion of the mass incarceration of black citizens, all to keep whites under the Democratic Party banner. But central to the success of the Democratic Party coalition was the role of unions in anchoring white workers, in particular, in the Democratic Party. So unions are essential institutions for sustaining a civic culture and public sphere that bridges racial and geographic differences, as well as institutions that help constitute citizens through the fact that people learn politics in their unions. They do political advocacy. They're trained to support electoral campaigns and on like that. But unions have been destroyed, and in particular in the Midwest. The heartland of industrial unionism is now rapidly becoming a non-union region. All right. The other thing that I want to point to illustrate this, well, first I want to look for a second at the electoral impact of the collapse of Fordist accumulation, but more importantly, institutions like unions, which ensured citizenship for industrial workers during the Fordist era. West Virginia, which was the second most pro-Trump state in the country in 2016 was the most solidly democratic state in the country between the New Deal and 2000. It had a more pro-democratic bent than any other state in the Union. With the collapse of steel, you very quickly, in the 1970s, you get quickly the collapse of coal mining industry in West Virginia, because anthracite coal is the main coal that's used to produce steel. It's not used for power as much, it's used to smelt steel. So without steel, you basically had a collapse of coal mining quite early on. With the collapse of coal mining, you get a collapse of the United Mine Workers, which is a core civic institution across West Virginia that lots and lots of West Virginia workers identify with now, today, even though the United Mine Workers only counts its membership in the tens of thousands. In 2000, you might recall, the Democrats nominated Al Gore, who was a climate warrior and wanted to ensure an energy transition. And in that year was the first year that West Virginia underperformed the national Democratic vote. Every year since, of course, West Virginia has moved very, very rapidly into the Republican column, such that in the last election it was the second most pro-Trump state in the country. It's impossible to my mind to separate West Virginia's political trajectory from both the nature of its political economy and the civic institutions and unions in particular in connecting people up to the political process and their parties. So the second thing that I want to talk about to illustrate this before I finish up is the trajectory of populism. The crisis of Fordism has produced populist revolts across the Rust Belt for 40 years now. People are thinking about Trump as the populist. He's just the latest in a long line of Rust Belt populists. Populist politicians like Dennis Kucinich have claimed to represent the people, overcoming the power of corporations. There have been battles between growth-oriented elites and self-described populist politicians in a number of Rust Belt cities. But in the 1970s, populism looked like this. Self-described urban populists looked like this. It was a cross-racial neighborhood coalition, and it was anti-corporate. Their goal was to get investment restarted into urban neighborhoods and to get that money from banks and corporations. Okay? By the 1990s, though, populism starts looking like this. That's Jim Traficant. He was a congressman who represented Mahoning County in the U.S. Congress. Before becoming a congressman, he was the sheriff of Mahoning County, who famously refused to execute foreclosure orders on Mahoning County residents, which made him extremely popular in the county. This is the county that's in complete crisis. There's mass structural unemployment, and people are losing their houses, and he refused to execute foreclosure orders. He also anticipated Trump's wild hairdo with a famous unkempt rug, which he claimed that he cut with a weed whacker. After he came to Congress, he battled the Clinton administration over issues like NAFTA. He was militantly anti-free trade for the very obvious reason that it would continue to destroy his community. And battled Clinton on a number of other issues as well. As he became increasingly isolated, because he would always do things like end his rants in Congress with things like, his famous line was, "Beam me up, Scotty, there's no intelligent life down here," which I don't think endeared him to his other congressional colleagues. But he started drifting to the right, and he started nativism became a big thing for him. He started interpreting the crisis of the region through a nativist lens and explaining this is a problem of immigration, right? He engaged in a struggle which associated with him with anti-Semitism. Most importantly, though, for his political trajectory was that he was mobbed up from the beginning of his career, and the FBI managed to finally throw him in jail on a RICO charge. He ran for Congress again from jail and won 15% of the vote. The other two pictures over there, this is JFK. He's talking to West Virginia workers about the war on poverty in 1964. This is a year, in 1960. This is a year when West Virginia was strongly Democratic. But of course now, the state looks much more like the picture on the bottom. This has been described in books like Harry Boyd's Backyard Revolution, a classic on the neighborhood revolt that was occurring across Midwestern cities in the 1970s. But we've forgotten this in our understanding of Trump and the trajectory of this region in the last election. Okay. So Trump's success in the Midwest is related to the geography of capital investment and the way changes in the institutions of political economy have shifted the landscape of geographical privilege. But much of this work was accomplished decades ago, when workers still had the organizational resources to resist, and they did resist to an extent. but without rejecting Democratic Party politics. What mattered in 2016 wasn't deindustrialization per se, but the collapse of the civic and political order that had been built on industrial capitalism and outlasted it. Understanding the half-life of institutional decay and transformation is necessary for explaining the Rust Belt Revolt in 2016. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. So on to the cultural resonance of symbolic boundaries discourse and Trump's triumph as it pertains to the case of the white working class. Making sense of Trump's victory. How did Trump the billionaire appeal to the white working class in the United States? Here's where we're headed today for this presentation. First of all, I'm going to briefly review the previous scholarship that's tried to understand this puzzle. We're going to go on and present our argument and the crux of this paper, which revolves around Trump's discourse and the boundary work that he deployed during the electoral cycle. We're going to present you the empirical study that we've done based on a computer-supported qualitative content analysis of 70 speeches that Trump gave during the electoral cycle, and briefly present the findings that revolve around the cultural resonance of symbolic boundaries discourse. Class struggle has been identified as a main cause and main reason behind Trump's victory in 2016, especially in the context of increasing economic and social inequality. Turlin, Mike Hout, for example, talk about downwardly mobile white working class people who previously were independent and this time around tipped the electoral balance. As a counter-argument, Jeff Manza and his colleague in a forthcoming paper in the forum talk about how Trump victory, quote, facilitated a broad-based appeal that centered on voters who have levels of education and income that are well above national and primary state averages. Racism has been another topic that has been really well covered, especially racism in the post-Obama era. Ollie Hochschild talk about the emotional self-interest that needs to be fulfilled. Fear of Muslim in an international context where terrorism became more prominent, along with the fear of global competition with illegal immigrants stealing their jobs. Justin Jess talks about the emergence of a new minority. He writes, the tension between the vestige of white class power and its perceived loss produces a phenomenon of their radicalization. In fact, people who have been deprived, as Michael has been talking previously, really feel their relative deprivation and desire some recognition that they haven't had. Others have talked about the reassertion of traditional gender roles. In our paper, we would like to argue that by performing boundary work, targeting specific groups that we're going to talk about later, Trump's rhetoric capitalized on and thus resonated with the sense of worth of the American white working class in relation to these groups. Herein lies its cultural power. In fact, Trump's 2016 electoral speeches capitalized on and appealed to work's needs for recognition. Trump was able to voice their concerns and capture their vote by removing the blame concerning their downward mobility and their financial insecurity. He deployed boundary work that elevated them in relation to other groups and that resonated with how they established their worth through symbolic, social, and even physical boundaries, as he talked about a wall at the southern border of Mexico. The data we used for this paper was 70 speeches that Trump made during his campaign. The transcripts were provided by the American Presidency Project, hosted at the University of California, Santa Barbara. The time frame of those speeches, from June 16, 2015, the day Trump announced his candidacy, up to the election day. And the method that we used was computer-assisted qualitative content analysis that allowed us to actually have a really nuanced and fine-grained analysis of the content of all of his speeches. Our analysis is structured around 3 sections. The first one is a comparison between the cultural world of the white working class men, as with a comparison of Michel Amon's book on the dignity of the working man, interviews conducted in '93. The second section is on Trump's electoral strategy, as he talks about being the anti-establishment politician who represents the white working class. And the most important part that we want to focus on in this presentation today is Trump's boundary work, and especially how he portrays women, LGBTQ, interracial groups, and immigrants. Please find here the word frequencies of the main pre-established codes we looked at. Not a surprise, immigrants can come in first with more than 300 counts. African Americans just follow. Workers, refugees, women, Latinos, and surprisingly Muslims, only 70 counts. In 93, frequent boundary work were made toward African American, and especially during election periods. Blackness was often conflated with hard living and laziness. In Trump's campaign speeches, however, African Americans are hard-working Americans who need to be cherished and protected. Their jobs need protection. Their lives need protection. You see a striking divergence. Immigrants, on the other hand. The references to immigrants were largely positive in 93. They were seen as hardworking, family-focused, and largely pursuing the American dream. There were no references to Muslims. In 2016, immigrants, as you know, are largely described as illegal and often related to immoral behaviors. Latino immigrants, most especially, are described as dangerous and harmful, rapists. They have killed innocent, forgotten people. Countless examples, countless names come out in the speeches. They also take away people's jobs, especially Black and Latino jobs, and take away benefits, including healthcare and other benefits, from deserving Americans. Muslim immigrants and refugees are described as probable Islamic terrorists. It's actually surprising how he links immigration to Islamic terrorism. They're dangerous to women, as they do not share their American values, and refugees also take away benefits from deserving Americans. And again, divergence. Women and LGBTQ, however, are often described as needing protection, and especially needing protection from Muslim terrorists in the case of 2016. While there were no references to LGBTQ people in 93, LGBTQ people are referenced in the context of needing protection from the outsiders and the radical Muslims. Last but not least, reference to the poor were very frequent and boundaries were strongly drawn against them in 93. References are rare or euphemized with a focus on bringing safety to urban poor neighborhoods. Putting down the poor was probably incompatible with Trump's broad populist strategy. Here are some of the recurring keywords per group. So as you can see, anti-establishment comes in first. Protection, illegality. Terrorism is also listed there. I have here a node matrix of groups by keywords. So that means that you see the relevance and basically the correlation between the two. Number of codes that we have actually coded. I want to draw your attention to two numbers. First one, immigrants and Islamic terrorism, 59 counts. Jobs and Americans, 80. The node matrix of positive and negative descriptions. So positive and negative descriptions here signify that basically we looked at the descriptions of the groups per se and assessed whether they were positive or negative. And as stated earlier, African Americans have basically a very positive connotation in Trump's speeches. Immigrants are on the opposite spectrum. So what this paper is ultimately doing, it's presenting a more nuanced understanding of Trump's victory in 2016. It goes, for example, beyond a static class struggle approach, looking at income levels. It also aims at developing a boundary work approach to the study of social change through electoral means. In fact, it investigates the transformation of boundaries as an engine of social change. And theoretically, it attempts to enhance our understanding of the usefulness of boundary work. Some of you may be asking, why talking about boundary work and not just deeper racism, for example? Well, we can give you two main explanations for that. First, it facilitates the comparison with groups that may not have the same attributes. As an example, immigrants. Most of them are from a racial ethnic minority group. African Americans are also part of a racial ethnic minority groups, and yet we don't classify them as immigrants, which means that immigrants and racial minorities have different properties. And understanding racism and understanding anti-immigrant sentiment might be two different things that we might be conflating. looking at boundary work enables you to actually look at the common denominator and the mechanism beneath the observed phenomenon. So you're not just talking about an isolated phenomenon, which is whether it be racism or anti-immigrant sentiment. You're looking at what Trump is doing in terms of making the us versus them boundary to actually get his votes. I'm gonna leave you with a quote. It's from the remarks that Trump made at the Cellular Center in Nashville, North Carolina, on September 12, 2016. While my opponent slanders you as deplorable and irredeemable, I call you hard-working American patriots who love your country and want a better future for all of our people. Above all else, you are Americans, and you're entitled to leadership that honors you, cherishes you, and defends you. Every American is entitled to be treated with dignity and respect in our country. The italics were Ida. Thank you.
Yeah, my name's Jay Arena. I'm at the College of Staten Island. I have a comment and critique for Professor Pearson, and a comment on Michael McQuarrie's presentation as well. Paul, you outlined a number of factors that led to Trump's rise that the Republicans contributed to. But it seems like on all those points, the Democrats have played a part in that as well. You pointed to the anti-government ideology of the Republican leadership, although many didn't support Trump. But you could say the same thing about the Democrats. 1996, the State of the Union address of Clinton, government can't do everything. As he slashed public housing, welfare, and then his successors, the Obama administration, people like Cory Booker, the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, have overseen the mass destruction of public education. And government can't do it, we have to turn it over to the private sector. Plutocratic power. Under those administrations, we've had a massive redistribution of wealth. And you tout the ACA as this, the biggest transfer of downward redistribution, when in fact it's been a huge redistribution to the insurance companies, which is why they went along with it. You talk about the anti-democratic structures that allowed Trump to punch above his weight. I mean, what the primary exposed was the anti-democratic nature, rigged game of the Democratic Party. And then on HRC's strategy of appealing to Republicans to woo them, I mean, you could have had a little bit of a critical analysis of why didn't she go after those counties that McQuarrie looks at, and how does that point to the the class character of the Democratic Party? And then finally, on your outcomes, you didn't include as a positive possible outcome is the collapse of the Democratic Party, right? And this is where it'd be maybe the critique with McQuarrie's presentation about these accompanying institutions like the Democratic, or the unions. It isn't so much been their collapse as their collaboration with the Democratic Party that has allowed the Republicans to fill the void. And one prime example is the AFT, one of the few unions that haven't been smashed, and they were the chief, Randy Weingarten, even though the Democrats have carried out the destruction of public education, they were one of the major supporters, tying the working class to the Democratic Party.
Should we gather some more questions, or do you want to go?
I think it's good to collect a bunch of questions.
Yes. Okay. Yes, one here.
Hi, Barry Eisen from McGill, and I have another question for Paul, actually. And it's simply something I've been puzzling about. I'd really be curious to hear your thoughts on, because I don't have a good answer for it. And that's, I'm wondering to what extent does the Republican Party's dysfunction that you aptly described, is that actually impinging the advancement of a Republican agenda? So to what extent is it possible, is that actually hurting their ability to implement some sort of favorable agenda for their constituencies, in the sense that if you just have this sort of, if they continue just being this sort of party of no and not getting anything done and being this huge circus, can, you know, one of yours and Jacob's favorite mechanisms of policy drift just sort of work its magic and like let them sort of continue to accumulate and redistribute upwards and do all the things that they want to be doing anyway without, you know, actually implementing anything positive?
You know, this is a massive phenomenon that we're dealing with, and so of course I'm not saying that this is the full story. And actually, I was listening to Michael's great presentation, and I don't think there was anything that you said that I disagreed with. I think you're right about all that, and it's obviously fundamental for thinking about the broader dynamics that made the current politics possible. Now, with respect, I will say with respect to the Democrats, I mean, it is factually true that the ACA was a hugely redistributed program to lower income groups. 20 million people or more got health insurance who didn't have it before. The insurance companies did benefit from it. And there's no question, you know, and it's a revealing feature of the modern American political economy that the Obama administration, in my view rightly, believed that if they did not cut deals with powerful private interests in the healthcare industry, they were not going to get legislation. Right? So one can argue about whether they were right or wrong about that. I'd be happy to have that debate. We've written about it at length. I'm confident that in that assertion, but we could argue about it at length. So of course, and I've written about this, Jake and I have written about this, there are huge, powerful moneyed interests, increasingly prominent moneyed interests in the Democratic Party. That is also true. There are also massive policy differences between Republicans and Democrats. And I think the evidence is clear, and again, we've written about this, that the policy differences between Republicans and Democrats are far greater today than they were 30 or 40 years ago. The consequences of which party is in a dominant position in Washington matter far more than they did 30 or 40 years ago. Right? Mostly because of the changes in the Republican Party, but that's not to say that there haven't been profound changes in the Democratic Party as well. Barry, as far as your question goes, I mean, it is certainly true that if they break government, right, and they break the capacity of regulatory agencies, and you can run down the list, and they transform the personnel in these regulatory agencies, that gives them a lot, right? So I'm not saying, you know, they haven't been able to do anything by any means. I'm not saying that. I think they're doing a lot less than they thought that they were going to be able to do. Right? The fact that they can't pass significant legislation, I don't think they're thrilled about that. And I think they're right, and I don't think it helps them politically that they can't do it.
Okay. Question here. Yeah.
My name is Roland Robertson, both of University of Pittsburgh, USA, and University of Aberdeen, UK. I make the point of making those two attachments clearly because I've heard virtually nothing about the relationship between Brexit and Trump, or the Brexit phenomenon has hardly been touched upon. It's very misleading because I think there is a hell of a lot of very interesting connections between the two. Not merely directly in terms of personnel, a lot of which has been written about in relatively untouched ways in different journals about the actual personal relationships and connections between the two over the ages. But I want to draw attention particularly to one particular phenomenon. There seems to be an equation, particularly in the comments of Macquarie, that populism is necessarily or automatically right-wing. If I'm mistaken in this, please correct me. I would argue that there is much populism on the left as there is on the right. I would prefer populism of the left to populism of the right, but that's not the point. Eric Hobsbawm, one of Britain's most famous historians, wrote a long book published posthumously on populism in Latin America, which he thoroughly approved of, which he inspired him to think there was great hope for the resulting socialism in Latin America. So that is but one example of the many, many examples of left-wing populism. I would claim, somewhat controversially perhaps, that Jeremy Corbyn is a classic case of left-wing populism in the UK. And there is much evidence to suggest the way in which he thinks, the way in which he ironically supports the same person or same country that Trump himself supports, namely Venezuela, or opposes in Venezuela. So I think I've said enough. because I'm trying to emphasize that populism is not necessarily right-wing. I'm also trying to say, perhaps we should have said, can say more about the Brexit phenomenon.
I'd like to speak to the first paper. I found the first paper very convincing as far as the voluntary surrender of state power to the supranational level, the EU and so on. Clearly very relevant to Brexit. And then tie that in with the US case. No one has mentioned NAFTA, World Trade Organization, trade deals as partly responsible for Trump's victory. But it seems to me that's very important. The decisive region was the upper Midwest, the former industrial Midwest. And think of 2012. Romney lost because he said the auto industry should go bankrupt. And Obama was in favor of saving the auto industry. Whereas in 2016, Clinton is entirely pro-free trade. She tried to co-opt Sanders' agenda to some extent, but I don't think anybody found that at all convincing. And so it seems to me that that same issue, even though it's not as pronounced in the US case, but that same issue of surrender of national autonomy to the supranational level in terms of NAFTA and so on, is a very important factor in people turning away from the Democrats toward Trump. So I'd be curious in your responses to that.
Yeah. Perhaps I can just ask a question, as I mean, partly responding to others was about more on Brexit and partly reflective on some of the issues raised by the panel, which is really, because one of the things which we try to think about in this special issue is how does sociology respond intellectually to the challenge of Brexit. And one of the issues which seems to me in different ways to go through all the papers, but I think is a weakness of sociology currently is we have lost a developed sociology of elites. And I think we can think it's very interesting current about how Moscow and Pareto, to quote two more Italian sociologists, to join Poggi, made this central to sociology 100 years ago, and because they're conservative, they've fallen out of the canon. But many of the issues which I think they pose around elite divisions, I think are very profoundly implicated. I think the issue which goes through Michael's paper and Patrick's paper about territorial divisions is very, very significant because London is basically the elite space. The British global elite don't care about much outside London, to be honest. And that was different. That would have been different 50 years ago when each big city would have had its local elites. And so I think there are bits of elite studies in the study of social networks and such like, but recognising that the shift of economic resources towards the top 1% has actually made elites much more powerful actors, but also actors which are more disconnected with the wider public. I think is a crucial feature. And I think, and this partly connects with Bojan's paper about boundary work, and my paper in the special issue is partly about the issue of racism in Britain, and sort of key nugget of the issue in Britain is Brexit has allowed racism to be more legitimate than was the case before. Racism has obviously has existed for centuries, but it's the way in which the Brexit vote allowed questions of racism to be made legitimate, and the way in which particular parts of elites went along with that. Which I think in a way is probably a new phenomenon, which may well tally with what we're seeing in the American context too. So I just want to throw that out really, that developing a better sociology of elites, which intersects with political science and economics and such like, is something which we as sociologists need not to see as a conservative act, which we're not interested in. I think we need to be doing more work on that. So that's my quick contribution. Patrick and...
Yep. Thank you. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And that's clearly one of the things actually we develop in the paper is actually making this sense. Again, then you can think about what sort of free trade, and you can think about some arrangements on trade. I'm from a French point of view, I'm also a little bit worried about those who want absolutely national sovereignty and nothing else, of course. What is striking is, of course, that leads to inequalities and regional decline for some territory, and nothing was done for that. And that's the contradiction of its three constituencies. So I think it works very well for the US as well. I think you're absolutely right. I agree with that.
Just to add on to the point that in the US case, we really don't talk about that as much. What can be found in the speeches is that it's not NAFTA, it's not the World Trade's fault, it's Clinton's decision. So it's very much framed as an attack to the Democratic Party, how they've betrayed all those people, and constantly Trump, I think he's a very strategic marketer in there, constantly emphasized that it was Clinton's decision and how Hillary really betrayed those people.
I'll add one thing about the free trade thing. The Clintons are both, I mean, in my experience, talking to workers when I was an organizer, they are both completely associated with NAFTA and free trade. And as a result, they are both horrible Rust Belt candidates. Clinton had the advantage of being the Bubba president, which, you know, made him seem like a nice guy to have a beer with. But Clinton didn't really have that same kind of charisma, right, to help overcome the fact that, you know, the Clintons are completely associated with deindustrialization in the Midwest. I actually was going to give an anecdote, but I mean, when I was an organizer, I was in the Central Labor Council in Dayton, Ohio, and at our annual picnic on Labor Day every year, the Central Labor Council paid to rent a crane with a wrecking ball, bought a brand new Toyota, and we finished the picnic by destroying the Toyota. And that was the draw. Like that, and that was on the pamphlet. Like, come and see the Toyota get wrecked, and everybody comes and pay their $5 for beer. Let's watch the Toyota get destroyed. I mean, like, it's absolutely inseparable from the politics of the region, but it's just one of a piece of a bunch of things. And deindustrialization, of course, gets rolling way before NAFTA. But I think you're absolutely right that the Clintons are completely associated with that. And you know, the reason Obama's not is because I actually think that we radically underestimate what a good Rust Belt politician Obama was. He could talk as a Midwesterner, and he was from Kansas. I mean, you know, he did cut his teeth in Chicago as a politician. I mean, he was a Rust Belt politician. I think he knew how to speak effectively to those people in a way that I don't think Hillary had much inclination to. I mean, she didn't campaign there or whatever. And, you know, like, she didn't really have much interest in doing it. But I think those are two pieces of it. I mean, we think of Obama as the first black president, but really what he was, I mean, not really, but in addition to which he was also the, you know, 13th Midwestern president. Yeah.
Charles Thomas from the University of Michigan Flint. I'd be interested in comments of the panel as we go forward, and yeah, thanks for the very helpful analyses that you've all provided. As we go forward, what role do you see for the Democratic Party? Just kind of following up on your last comments about a candidate that didn't really appeal to the Rust Belt in this election. What role do you see in this mix of forces and factors for the Democratic Party as we move into the future?
Hi, I'm Bill D'Antonio. I'm not sure it's directly a question. In 1966, I participated in a movement with the Guttmacher Institute to bring about Planned Parenthood. And we managed to do it by getting a professor from Georgetown to write a brief that the ABA put its blessing on, and the brief was written in such a way that Planned Parenthood could appeal to all religious groups by providing every method of birth control that was known, including rhythm. And we worked through people from both parties and brought it about with minimum of conflict in 1966. As I look at the Planned Parenthood battle today, it makes me very sad to think of the inability right now to find a way to bring the two parties together. In '66, we worked with both parties, and we just did not have the kind of conflict on an issue that, and we actually kept the bishops, the American bishops, silent. By the way, this lawyer from Georgetown wrote the brief showing how Planned Parenthood could appeal to everybody.
Thank you.
I don't have an answer. All I have is a rather degree of sadness that one of the key issues of contemporary women's health today is endangered by the failure of being able to bring parties together.
Yeah, thank you.
I have two questions. One on the boundary discussion. So you looked at his speeches, but I'm really curious about sort of the emphasis on African Americans and sort of how he communicated, which differs from how he communicates on a regular sort of ad hoc basis. And what he communicates to and about African Americans is quite different than what I think your analysis shows. And so I'm a little bit concerned about where that goes. And then the second question I have, I think is directed to Paul. This emphasis on the Rust Belt, the sort of working class white male, I'm a little concerned about our compartmentalization of this and the direction that that goes in terms of the emphasis. But one question I have is, and this is with Virginia on my mind, what happens when the needs that have been articulated for this particular group do not get met? Because it's not going to get met in this administration, because this administration has no interest in meeting those needs. So what happens when that population does not get what they believe they deserve and what they feel they need? I'm just curious about what your thoughts and observations are about that.
I was curious about the Rust Belt has women in it as well as men, and everybody's remarks were all about white men, but there were a lot of white women who voted for Trump. And I'm also interested in the issue of the energizing role of the state and why that works for some people but not for others. It's not a complete collapse because more than half of the voters voted for the Democrats. So something's working for some set of the people, clearly, but you've been defining it in fairly narrow terms, I think.
Okay, shall we work through the panel and get any last comments and reflections on those questions, but also any final statements you want to make? Start with you, Patrick.
2 points. Number one, we didn't answer the populism of the left, which I think is also a very important question. And what we see, especially in Southern Europe, is limitation to right-wing populism, but also, as you mentioned, for Corbyn, but we see that quite strongly, left-wing groups playing bad populism for good and bad reasons and from interesting ideas as well, but in a very strong way. So I think it's a very fruitful way of thinking to compare this combination of right-wing and left-wing populism as answers to those phenomena. On this unifying energy of a state, you could argue that maybe some of those states nowadays, the unifying energy is more with this outside constituency than inside, and that does marginalize some groups.
Thank you. Paul?
Great set of questions tonight. It's been a really fun panel to be on. Let me just say a couple of things about the Democrats going forward, because I think that's a great question to focus on. One is, and I am not a big fan of political science analyses of voting and elections and the preoccupation of political science with voting and elections, but it is, I think, worth recognizing that if you look at the models that those folks generate about presidential elections, that the vote share between the parties, between what you would expect for a generic Democrat versus a generic Republican in this election, given the kind of background conditions that they focus on in those models, we got about the result that we would expect, right? Now, one can say, given Trump, Democrats should have done a lot better, and that's an interesting conversation to have. But I do think part of the answer to that is, some of it has to do with what's going on the Democratic side, but a lot of it has to do with what's going on the Republican side and the fact that they are just simply going to vote for the Republican candidate, right? Barring really, really extreme circumstances. And some of that has to do, well, there are a bunch of factors that play into that. The role of the media and increasingly polarized media, especially on the right, that's a really important part of it. Second thing, and I feel like I heard this in a fair number of the questions, I think we all have to really resist the temptation to jump to I told you so kind of analyses, or if only you did what I want you to do, it all would have been okay, right? Maybe it's true, right? That if only our pet, idea about what the Democratic Party should be or should do, it all would have worked out fine. But I think we need to be really, really careful. And I'm guilty of that too. I have my ideas, right? But I think we should really, really inspect those ideas carefully and not just think that because there's a horrific election outcome it means, that our pet idea is the idea. And then the third thing that I would, and this is partly an answer to your question about, what happens when these powerful constituencies are not, well, they're powerful, they're electorally important. They're not powerful in some other ways. What happens when they're disappointed by the current administration, and to what extent should Democrats be thinking about reaching out to those constituencies, and how this is a huge, fraught, complex question. And I just want to highlight one thing that I think is relevant for thinking about it. This is something that Jacob and I are starting to do some work on, and it connects to some of the discussion of geography that's come up on this panel, and I just think geography is increasingly important. Given the design of American political institutions, Democrats are at a huge structural disadvantage to the extent that they rely so heavily upon urban areas to generate their votes. A huge structural disadvantage, right? And that's true in the Senate, right? It's true in the House, and not just because of gerrymandering, right? You draw the lines however you want in the Bay Area, you're going to get a bunch of districts where Democrats are wasting a huge number of votes, right? So I'm not saying gerrymandering isn't an issue, but if you have, we actually have a set of political institutions, a constitution, that says the amount of real estate you control matters, right? Not just how many people, but where they're located, right? So that's that, and now we have a political system, a party system that's dividing more and more along those lines. That is real, that's a big deal, right? And so Democrats might be able to win an election in a backlash, right, without doing much about that. But I think over the medium to long run, there is no substitute for finding ways to reach into outer suburbs and rural areas and getting some votes, right? And there are probably a bunch of, that's not the only thing, right? Maybe not even the most important thing, but it has to be part of it.
Thank you. Bill Young?
Well, thank you so much. I second what Paul said. It was really fun to be on this panel. Just wanted to end by saying that when you look at the speeches, you actually would be surprised to see that there's stuff that you assumed would be this way and actually weren't not. So it's actually very important to actually go back and to critically analyze what happened, what was there, what was not there, what we assumed to be there. And I think that goes to your question about the African Americans. That was a surprise, and I think that's why I wanted to highlight the numbers in red. I'm going to answer your questions by reading you a quote from one of his speeches that he delivered in Dimondale, in Michigan. The African American community has given so much to this country. They fought and died in every war since the Revolution. Yet nearly 4 in 10 African American children still live in poverty. In a Trump administration, all workers of all colors will get priorities for jobs in their own country, which is about time. I want higher wages for African Americans, for Hispanic Americans, and for all Americans. And that comes in almost every speech. So he really was trying to get the black vote. Of course, he failed. But I think it was interesting to see that one interesting puzzle that comes out of this is, why are we still talking about racism when he was portraying African Americans in such a positive manner, right? So, but so that's right on to my point. What was behind the discrepancy between his formal and informal speeches? And why was it so different? What was his strategy in terms of trying to appeal a certain way through Twitter and trying to appeal in a different way in the formal speeches?
Michael?
So this actually relates to the question that you had about what happens when Trump doesn't meet expectations. And I mean, I think it's actually, I'm concerned because I think he might meet expectations. So if the issue is the absence of citizenship and belonging, now, in the Portis era, you included people by providing them living wages and social mobility for their kids. But if your only voters are white people, you can also make them feel like they belong by reasserting white supremacy and institutionalizing it. That can make people feel like they belong as well. I actually don't think that has a very broad-based appeal, but it certainly mobilizes people. We're seeing a lot of that right now, as you well know. And so I think that will likely be the kind of strategy that I don't know if that'll work. I mean, it'll be like one of the two. Like, none of them are good outcomes, right? But Paul was pointing out this is a very weak coalition, and actually, in a lot of ways, in talking about the Rust Belt Revolt, I'm talking about a very long-term series of trends that are occurring in that region. But really, he got lucky in the Rust Belt. I mean, we're talking about very marginal numbers of voters making the difference in these states. And but what's surprising is how well Obama did there, and the fact that Clinton couldn't pull it together enough to win these states. I mean, that's really what was so shocking about it. But I mean, it still was a very marginal win. But this does raise a broader question, which you asked about the Democrats. And to me, this really boils down to what your model of voters is and what your model of people is. If you assume that people's voting reflects who they fundamentally are as a person, and you look for the lowest common denominator of what they have in common, then the Democrats cannot rebuild a viable coalition that reaches beyond cities around the Rust Belt, because we've decided that all those people are racist, and that's why they voted for Trump. If, however, you think people are complicated, and they actually have a lot of issues going on, then you start thinking, well, maybe they didn't vote for Trump because he's a racist, and actually all the cluster analyses of voting show that there were a lot of people who voted for him because they're racist, but there were also a lot of people that really weren't concerned with race at all who voted for him. So if people are complicated and they're movable politically, then really the goal is to try and figure out ways of reconstructing social solidarity and having a Democratic Party that has a principle of social solidarity which is completely lost. Now it's a party of meritocracy. Meritocracy doesn't mean anything to people who are in destroyed communities that their kids aren't going to go to college. They have no way of advancing themselves. It doesn't mean anything to them. And as our friend Lisa McKenzie was pointing out, meritocracy comes from a British novel, which is specifically about satirizing social privilege. And the ludicrousness of the idea that the people who are running things got there because of merit is revealed in this novel, but we all take it seriously, and the Democratic Party takes it seriously. And the real effect of it, of course, as I'm assuming a lot of you know, is that white men keep getting to run things. Meritocracy becomes an excuse for white men to keep running stuff. It doesn't actually reflect merit. So these are core questions, but what I wanted to get at here was that actually people in the Rust Belt have a lot of different issues going on, and they have a lot of different ways of expressing their politics. In the 1970s, their populism was on the left, and it was cross-race. In 1990 and 2000s, it's not. And why is that shift happening? I don't think it's because everybody suddenly became racist. I think it's because the institutions through which you could bridge residentially segregated communities around some sort of political agenda have disappeared. And that's really what I wanted to emphasize. The last thing I want to say is I don't think I mentioned white men once. I don't think of the Rust Belt as white men. I specifically said I see this as also reflecting black voting in the Rust Belt. And I think the collapse of the Fordist order impacts women just as much as men. It just does so in different ways. The main one being, and you probably know this, is that women are now breadwinners instead of men. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. So please keep an eye out for the special issue of the BJS, which will come out in early November. And can we thank the panel for a terrific discussion?